these are doing much better than the ones over there.
What can I say? All right, so I'll do a little introduction and I'll talk about the project. Does that work? Okay. All right, so my name is Carmen. I work at FAU Pine Jog Environmental Education Center, which is in West Palm, and we have an orchid propagation lab. So what we do is we have a permit to collect endangered or threatened native orchids of Florida. We go and do a survey of the populations. We collect some seed pods. We bring them into the lab. And we use these seeds to grow orchids to be able to do restoration projects, educational projects, and anything in between. So this lab was established in 2015, I believe, with the help of Fairchild Botanical Gardens. They have a Million Orchid project that they've started. So we kind of like pair up with them to be the West Palm satellite of that program. And from there, we're expanding to do other projects like this one. So we are at Grassy Waters, and we are in an undisclosed island where we have started this research project. So what you see in front of you, these are one type of orchid called Bletia purpurea, and these are ground orchids. So a lot of people don't know that there's two types of orchids. There's epiphytic orchids, which are the ones that grow on the trees or on other things. They have even found them growing on ice. And there's terrestrial orchids, which are in the ground. So these specific orchids are natural in wetlands habitats like this one, in grassy waters. So what we wanted to work along with Grassy Waters was to say, let's test how well they do in this kind of environment, and then maybe add up a couple other sites and see how well they do there. Because these orchids can do full sun, they can do shade, and they can lose all of their leaves, but they have pseudobulbs that will help them come back when it's time to grow the leaves again. So they have a variety of survival possibilities. So the way that we created this project was, let's find out, when we usually plant them out, we plant them out in clumps all together. But I don't know their survivability by individual plants. So what we decided at Grassy Waters is to create a grid. So you can see that this is a square, and there's letters and numbers on each flag. So we have A, B, C, D, E, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay? So I created a data sheet. So whenever somebody comes and looks at it, they're gonna come over here and look at this tag that is also on the ground. And it says A1, BP3, 2 bulbs, 8 leaves. So they're gonna look at the data sheet and count, be able to see if there's still 8 leaves, if there's still that many pseudobulbs, if you can feel it. We don't really wanna dig them out, but sometimes they can come to the surface. So, individual orchids on the grid, and then we also created communal pods to find out if they do better together or if they do better separate. The other variant that we have is that we have 2 mother plants here. So what we did when we collected the seed pods is we went to one mother plant, collected those seed pods, grow the orchids in the lab, put them into soil and bring them here. And then on a different side, we collected a different seed from another mother plant, brought it to the lab, grew it, and now put it out here. So we have 2 mother plants that we're testing here to figure out if there's a differentiation. Will that mean that the genetic material for one is better than the other, or is it just survivability in a different aspect? So that is an interesting thing that could kind of like pan out from this project. If somebody has access to a lab that does any kind of genetic material, it will be interesting to take a sample of that plant and figure out the differentiation between the 2. Okay? Anybody has any questions? No?
I actually have a list of questions for students that are not here.
Okay.
I'll give it to you. I'll give it to you when you're ready.
Okay. So we tested these 2 sites. They had more trees around originally. So Cindy and the Grassy Waters crew clear the area so we can plant these orchids, and same thing on that area. So they're similar. Obviously the island has some kind of common characteristics, but they also also have some difference even within this area. Do you know what kind of tree that is, Cindy, in the middle?
It was probably either a cocoa plum or perhaps a holly.
Okay.
I do not remember.
So you can see when you go and visit the other side I noticed it has a lot more of these little, they're called knees, or cypress trees. They use that to obtain more oxygen. So I noticed that in the other side, and that might be a differentiation or not, but it's kind of like those observations that you want to write down. Okay, so if there's time, I will look at the orchids and count them if we want to, or if we want the students to do it, we can work something out as well. Okay?
And we have the light meter.
Yes.
So as you look around you and you look behind Carmen to her right side, both of these spaces were exactly what you see. We have probably 6 visits out here with teams of 5 to 6 volunteers, and we literally went through and hand pulled all the cocoa plum seedling, and that'll be something that we'll need to continue to do to keep the island open for these plants. And our intent is that this is going to be a long-term project for Grassy. In the paper that Dr. Wetterer shared with you and with us, one of the points they made was about it didn't appear there were a lot of long-term follow-up studies on many of the plantings that they did. So we're hopeful that with our Grassy volunteers and continuing with future senior classes, that we'll be able to keep coming out here routinely. But we'll do trimming, you know, we'll look at what surveys she has. We may actually have a few of you pulling any of the little plants that are growing up in between the orchids, because our goal is to keep this clear so that the orchids will have the ability to spread, which is most important to us. And there is some poison ivy, so if you step out of the clearing, be a little careful. Anything that you see that is vine oriented, be careful of, or 3 leaves. Otherwise, if you're just seeing little things like this, this is our cocoa plum, which is a very important beneficial plant to our wildlife. The berries, the raccoons, the deer, everything, the pigs, everything eats it. And that's what this island is predominantly covered in, would be cocoa plum, then holly, a few of our sable palms, our native tree, and then a few pines, which that's telling us that this island is drier, and that's how it was chosen by our watershed manager. When we came in November, the water really was to at least where Carmen is. And back into here, it was very, very high. But all of the vegetation that's here can tolerate that dry down, being flooded for a while. So from November, when we had the massive rains, to now, wow, it's just an incredible drop down. But so we have questions. You want to do questions and then we'll do some surveys, or what do you want to do?
That works. We want to start.
I actually left the questions that people sent. 5 people sent in advance. I left it in the jar.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
So if you have extra questions,
Off the hook.
remember
All right.
your questions.
So,
one of them was, how long can a properly cared for orchid live?
how long can they what?
Can a properly cared for orchid live? And my assumption is it
so
varies.
It depends on the orchid. So what I have experienced, some of the orchids that are at pine jog, the epiphytic orchids, can probably be, estimated of a 20-year-old orchid. But so what they do is they start with 1 pseudobulb and 1 leaf, and then they'll start kind of like piling those pseudobulbs as they grow and get new ones. So, or they grow new ones. So they'll stop feeding the older pseudobulbs. So you will find this specimen that has a lot of dried up pseudobulbs and beautiful green new pseudobulbs. So I don't think there's an actual system of aging them, because that would take, probably taking some samples and taking them into the lab. But looking at the orchid, if it's pretty massive and you can study the area where it is, if it hasn't been disturbed or whatnot, then you can probably estimate. Same thing with the ground orchids. They also have pseudobulbs, so they kind of like pile them up.
So how old are these ones?
These are about 3 years old. So from seed to this big, it takes that long for them to be. And this is one of the successful orchids. We have other orchids that take forever to grow.
Very slow.
So what we're gonna do then is you're gonna help us collect the data. So is there 4 students or 5?
5.
5. Okay. So I'll take 2 students here,
You got the
and
glasses?
3 students will go with Bethany.
Oh, wow.
And we're gonna go through the grid and make you count the leaves and see if we can actually check mark those and say, okay, it still has 8 leaves or still has 2 and that kind of stuff. Okay?
Oh, you
Carmen, you
counted
got
the
the
leaves
questions.
when
You
you
got the
planted them?
questions.
Yeah.
Oh, perfect.
You got the
it's
questions?
also on the tags too.
Oh, lovely.
Yeah, and also, I don't know if you guys are all gonna get a copy of these, but it's,
I'm not in the class.
it's on the original spreadsheet,
Or do you want to?
so we know what we're starting with.
Oh, very nice.
Okay,
No, I was thinking for the next site,
are you ready?
California.
I guess so.
Sarah, are you filming?
Yeah, been
Okay,
filming this
first
whole
one.
time.
Anna asks, when reintroducing orchids, is there a risk of harming other native plants or animals that benefit from the absence of orchids? If not, are the orchids neutral or beneficial to the environment?
Okay, that's a great question. I think there is 2 parts to that question. If it's ground orchid and then epiphytic orchid, I think they have different roles. So when it comes to ground orchids, they obviously have been, their population is declining because of urbanization, right? All of the soil has been stirred up, has been changed, and if these orchids don't have the right chemistry on that soil, they're not gonna grow. They have, I always get asked if they have kind of like an important role, assuming that plants only have a role if they're eaten by something else, right? Which is not true. In the case of epiphytic orchids, they actually are associated with clean air. So if there's a lot of orchids in your area, that means that the air quality is pretty good. So when it comes to the epiphytic orchids, it's my personal opinion, I guess, that it's not really that they're going to mess up the plant system or the animals or anything that lives in there, because they were here before us, and we're just kind of helping to bring back that population.
Okay. Oh no, it disappeared.
So, and another data point about the beneficial opportunities that orchids might present are some are pollinated by insects,
It went dark and I pressed it.
so
And then said I got
it is
50.
beneficial to the insect.
Where do
Right.
I press to make it?
Although orchids are
Okay.
tricky in that because they really don't provide anything to the insects.
No nectar.
Nope, most of them don't. They just trick them into. Evolutionary. They've gotten to the point to just pretend that they have this, release that scent to make the animal think that they're a male of the same species, so they come and fight it. But they don't really have any communal benefit, I guess. It's just the way that the plant tricks them to get them to continue propagating.
So they help. Do they help with the pollination though?
Well,
somewhat?
the insects do, but they
Yes.
get tricked into it because they don't get anything
The insects
out.
aren't getting a benefit.
Right,
Very often.
right. But there are some orchids that they have actually identified, semi-epiphytic orchids that do feed gopher tortoises or marsh rabbits. So it depends. Yes.
Aren't there some orchids that produce like oil that the male bees use to attract females?
Some of them do, yeah.
Oh, I don't know if you said that.
I wasn't. We just started talking about pollinators, but that is an important thing to mention too. Yes.
Okay, next question. Zoe says, how important are orchids to the ecosystem? What do they provide? What are the most extreme consequences of all orchid loss? What kind of populations do orchids support? How are orchids adapting or not
Well,
adapting
that's
to
more
global
than one
warming and
question.
climate change?
Okay, well, we'll start again with the role of the importance of them. Like I said, they are known to be food for some native animals, so gopher tortoises and marsh rabbits here in Florida. They are they need pollinators, most of them, and then some of them have actually evolutionized into doing their own seeds, so they don't even need pollinators for that. But they do need the habitat. They do need to have those trees or those spaces of land where they can actually land and be able to grow. The tricky part about orchids too is that they need something called mycorrhizae. I don't know if any of you have read about it. So it's very particular per orchid. A lot of studies are happening now with mycorrhizae. So what they're trying to identify is what kind of mycorrhizae are critical for what orchid to be able to, number one, to germinate, number two, to continue growing, and number three, to fruit. So that's the whole purpose of the orchid, right? To go around and be able to continue their population. So that is a part of research that hasn't happened enough. They think that it's very important to know that association, because if that mycorrhizae is not present, then it's going to affect the rest of the surrounding environment. She asked something about climate change.
Yeah, how have are orchids adapting or not adapting to global warming and climate?
So what I've noticed
Yeah, they're
is
not.
that they're migrating with the warmer temperatures. Like Encyclia tempensis used to be found only to Lake Okeechobee. Now they're finding in even northern parts of that, but it's because those areas used to freeze, so they were not able to survive there. Now they can go a little further because of that.
Okay.
Did I miss something else in her question?
It
was a compound
We'll move on to the next one anyway, but okay,
Okay.
Riley. Okay. Are there other orchids that are threatening the population of orchids besides habitat? Are there other things that are threatening the populations of orchids besides habitat losses? Is the removal of orchids by orchid hobbyists just as detrimental as habitat loss? I'm having trouble reading. When the orchids are being reintroduced, are there any animal species in these habitats that could pose a threat to the survival of the orchid?
Okay, so let's see if I remember all those parts.
Hobbyists are stealing.
Hobbyists, yes. When hobbyists take them, they usually take mature orchids. So that is a big impact on that population, because you're taking the mother plant, what is actually producing the seeds, and making it, taking it home, and it's not really going to continue growing in that area. So that affects the population that way. The other thing that affects orchids also is pesticides. So any kind of pesticides that people are washing out in their lawn to be able to have all that green, beautiful grass will affect them, because it changes the pH of the soil. It can also add more nutrients to it and have some of those algae explosions as well. So that can affect them. And was there something else?
Wildlife.
Wildlife. So if when you outplant them, yeah, some of the animals, I've seen iguanas when they're climbing up the trees and we attach epiphytic orchids, they'll push them away. I've also seen some of the curly tail
Little gecko.
thank you, lizards, actually chew on the leaves, but they won't chew the pseudobulbs, so the leaves can grow back again. So we've noticed that.
Yeah, and the hogs.
Yeah, the hogs can uproot the area too, which is why Grassy Waters people put up a camera to be able to see if there's animals coming across, if they will be even interested in the plants or wanting to eat it.
Oh, and fires too.
Yeah. So we've lost a lot of our orchids because of fires that actually the local sites have organized and put together, and forgot to ask the restoration people where they put the orchids, and just burned the whole place down.
We lost like over 50 orchids.
Yeah,
Yeah.
which were actually flowering and seeding. So we were going back to collect the seeds, and all the orchids were gone. So that's another.
Okay,
That's
next
another
question.
thing. Okay.
Ready? Isha says, do all varieties of orchids have a long lifetime? Do orchids evolve with climate change? What are the requirements to create orchid-enhanced habitats?
Orchid enhanced habitats. I think for that it will be a lot of protection, like areas that are separated for just being wild areas. And I've seen it more and more in some of the management areas, that some are just left to be on their own, and but they also have to be careful with invasives because they flourish pretty quickly if they're not managed. Was there an age question?
Yes.
How,
Do
if
they
there's
all have long life?
I don't know what the definition of long life. I think 20 years for a plant is pretty old. But I've never read about a 100-year-old orchid. I know there was one orchid in Everglades National Park, which is a Pseudopodium punctatum, and it's the cigar orchid. And it was one of the last large specimens of that orchid that was known. And it fell with one of the storms, which I guess it's another thing that also can disturb their growth. And they try to replace it in a different area, but it died anyway. So those are pretty much, and like the ghost orchid is another one that everybody talks about, and it's a leafless orchid, so it's such a pretty orchid. It has specific types of pollinators that pollinate it, so if there's no pollinators, there's no more of those flowers. So all of those associations with research, with more research that is happening now specifically on orchids, we can address those problems. And with the climate change is what I said, if it gets warmer as we move up in latitude, then they'll be able to colonize those areas as well.
Okay, so the next one, Alex asked, how do orchids reproduce? What is the life cycle of an orchid, and how long can a properly cared for orchid live?
Properly cared for. So how do they reproduce? Obviously they create flowers, and some of them need to be cross-pollinated by an insect. Some of them are very specific with the pollinator that they need. So the pollinator comes to one flower, they have actually pockets called pollinia in the orchids. Sometimes it depends on the orchid. So the animal will come out with like 2 little pockets of pollinia and go to the next flower. And then the way that orchids have the design of their flower is for them sometimes to fall into kind of like a bucket. And then for them to be able to get out, they have to go through the tunnel where they actually fertilize that orchid. So depending on the species, they're very, very complex plants when it comes to reproduction. And there's some of them that have, which is something I find very interesting, some of them have created their own way of reproducing, so they don't even need to open their flower. They just kind of start growing the flower, and then they go into seed. They don't even need that cross-pollination or any of that. They don't need nobody. They're just like, oh, I'm gonna create my own seed pod. So I wonder if that is an evolutionary thing, like they lost their pollinator and then they had to figure out a way to continue growing, or if it's something else. If it's like, is that mechanism of reproducing older than actually using the pollinators?
So they're clistigamous flowers? They never open at all?
No.
So one thing is interesting, the invasive orchids, the orchids that spread are often able to self. And so it's important that if you're new to an area, if you can't self, then you can't self-pollinate. And I think it's interesting, isn't it the monk orchid is rain pollinated?
Yeah.
Basically, if you have a monk orchid inside with just the flowers, it won't produce seeds. But if it gets hit by rain, then that causes it to self-pollinate.
So one interesting thing, so they have a cap over the anthers, and they need rain, and it pops off, and the anthers actually swing down and hit the stigma.
Yeah, and that's interesting because that's not a native orchid.
No,
Yeah.
that's one of the ones
So it's interesting to see how they have created their own reproduction system because of the way that where they are, what works for them. But what I always tell my students about orchid seeds is that evolutionary, they have lost their endosperm. So when you think of a seed and you think of an avocado seed, that's a pretty big seed, right? It falls from the tree and it grows a new plant right next to it. So orchids want to diversify their genetic material. So what they did is they lost all of that food that actually maintains that seed alive, and it just has the genetic information in those tiny little seeds. They're like dust. So what they do, once the seed pod opens, there could be 1 million of seeds inside that seed pod, and the wind carries it as far as it can. And another association that I've read about is that a lot of orchids actually let go of their seeds during hurricane season, which makes even more sense for them to be carrying those seeds even farther away. And then that takes you to the conversation of saying, okay, so the orchids that are found in the Bahamas and the orchids that are found in Florida, and they're a similar species, which one was first? Did it come from the Bahamas, or they go from Florida to the Bahamas? So that's an interesting conversation too.
Okay, next one. Okay, how have the orchids evolved over time to adapt to climate change? That's another same thing. And how have the adaptations affected other wildlife?
I'm not sure about other wildlife that comes to my mind right now, but evolutionary, definitely they've been able to acquire that seed proliferation, you know, to be able to open up. A lot of the storms that come from Africa too, they transport a lot of seeds as well, and they can just actually come across the Atlantic if it's a good enough storm.
Well, I mean, the funny thing is some people have proposed that that's how the monk orchid might have gotten to the New World. The only problem with that is if that were true, then you would expect it to spread then really fast to other places too. They could really travel those long distances.
Right.
But instead, it first appeared in southern South America, and then it has slowly spread, and then sometimes had little jumps. So actually, at least for the monk orchid, it doesn't seem like it's belonging all the way from Africa, because it's native to Africa.
Right.
Is that it doesn't fit the pattern that you see of the spread of the monk orchid.
And the other issue with that too, because these seeds are so small, that's how they actually get, you know, one of the sources is mulch. So when you get mulch from other sites and you have these little tiny orchid seeds and you put your mulch wherever it goes, you're putting all those orchids in there. So if the conditions are right for that orchid to grow, it's going to grow.
Okay, so next says, how long does it take to grow an orchid from seed to fully flowering? Are there benefits of orchids in our ecosystem? In which climates can orchids not survive?
So the only place that it's known to not have orchids is the frigid area, so the Antarctica, although they have had some documentation of orchids growing on ice in the Himalayas, I think.
Huh.
So, and they grow on rocks too, which is really interesting, but they're found everywhere. What was the other part of the
How
question?
long does it take to
How
grow?
long does it take? So in the lab, we cheat a little bit. So we give the orchid all of the nutrients that it needs to be able to germinate. Takes the orchid probably a little longer, so it gets, you know, a little bit more technical because there's something called lignin. So it's a coat that the orchid on the seed has, and what the mycorrhizae does is actually break that coat to be able for this seed to germinate if the mycorrhizae that is around them actually is the right one for them. So if all of those things happen, I would say, like I said, these are about 3-year-old ground orchids, but we have orchids in the lab that have been, you know, maybe 4 years since we collected the seed pods. I think that's the oldest one because, like I said, our project started in 2015.
Well, and O. maculata can grow from seed to actually flowering size in a year.
Yeah, so
It depends.
I've heard Fairchild has had these orchids, these Bletia purpurea, in flasks, and they didn't get to them fast enough to deflask them, that they had flowers in the flask. So that could happen too. Some of these seeds actually are so strong and so determined to survive that they'll do whatever it takes to go, yeah.
Okay, now the last one is, how did the pandemic affect Grassy Waters since people had to social distance? Did it affect the attention that the plants required?
So we started, well, we did this planting, oh my God, what day was it?
2 weeks ago?
2 weeks ago. So I guess we got delayed a little bit. We could have started earlier, but so ideal planting time for orchids is during the wet season. The difference with these are that they're terrestrial, so they're in the ground. The ground would hold the water a little longer, so they might be able to survive even during the dry season. So I don't think it affected it as much. But again, this area is not a transit area. I mean, nobody comes through this island. These are going to be undisturbed by people that come to Grassy Waters. And I don't think the other ones that we planted a year and a half ago have been disturbed, I guess, by people either, because they're pretty high up in the cypress trees in the middle of the wetlands.
Because of how frequently orchids are pilfered and stolen, which is very common and a large reason for their numbers being so low and threatened and endangered. We chose this island because it did not have public access, and what we planted around our boardwalk, we chose much higher and off, out of reach, because if we didn't, we would absolutely have loss.
Sticky hands.
We are trying to protect them.
Yes. But in our, what I've learned from Fairchild as well is that I'd rather people steal the ones that were grown in the lab than people stealing the very mature orchids that are producing seed pods every single year and maintaining that population.
Yeah.
So if that's kind of like the give and take, I'd rather have that. Yeah.
I guess I was wondering, with the Million Orchid Project now like providing a legitimate source for people to have native orchids, would it be harder to track down native orchid poachers? Because before, if they had one, it's like, oh, you poached it.
You mean when they sell them?
Yeah.
So what we've talked to them about that, and the way that they limit that is like they grow them, they sell them, but they only have a 15 radius delivery limit. So if you order some, you can only be 15-mile radius away from Fairchild. So it's a way of controlling it. That doesn't mean that once you order it, you know take it with you wherever you go. But they also have, they develop an app to be able to track those orchids, to find out how they're doing, to collect the data, so they have more of an impact that way. And what they're promoting it as well is that you're getting like 12 orchids. So you're really establishing a population wherever you put these orchids. And these are not really for you to put inside because they're babies. You want to put them on trees, so you're still helping by putting them out into the natural areas, even if it's in your neighborhood. You know, you're helping to bring those back and care for them. That's the other thing. Stewardship is a really important thing with that program. Is kind of like identifying yourself with that plant. That's my plant, so I'm going to take care of it. I think it's important, I think it's valuable, and it cost me money to put it, so, yeah.
Yeah, the education is a huge component, and getting the school children involved and the park awareness. So hopefully the program develops that, you know, FAU, and we're hopeful that through the city of West Palm Beach, we can really learn a lot and understand the process and then take it to our city parks and work with a couple of different kinds of orchids. So that's the end goal, would be to improve the awareness of our citizens and create that passion and care like Carmen was talking about.
Yeah.
And just get more orchids into Florida.
Yeah. Yep. So, all right.
What other
Anybody else?
questions?
I hope I answered the question. Yeah. Okay. All right, so do we have time to count leaves or no?
I think so.
We have time.
Let's do it.
It's 3 o'clock.